By mid-1941, the Southeast Asia and Pacific region were a time bomb about to explode. Growing tensions between the United States and Japan have reached the point of no return, and the escalation of hostility was imminent. Ever since Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and expanded its aggression on the rest of China, the relations between the two nations had been deteriorating, but the spark that ignited the flames of the upcoming conflict in the Pacific were events that took place thousands of kilometers away, on the other side of the world. In the spring of 1940, phony war in Europe ended, when the German Wehrmacht steamrolled across Low Countries and France. In June 1940, when panzer divisions were advancing towards Paris, France collapsed, and on June 17, the new government under Marshal Pétain asked for an armistice. 3 days later, the Japanese government presented the French ambassador in Tokyo with a first demand concerning their colony in Indochina, when they requested control over the Haiphong port, used for bringing supplies to the Chinese army. The further claims kept coming, and by September 22, 1940, a weakened Vichy French government allowed Japan to occupy northern Indochina. Although formally still a French colony, and with the French administration remaining in place, the actual Japanese control of Indochina allowed them to prepare bases for their troops, and establish a military presence in the region, becoming a threat to British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia. Later that month, to further strengthen its position, on September 27, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, joining a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy. In reaction to these developments, on September 29, the United States announced an embargo on the export of scrap iron and steel to Japan. The final nail in the coffin, which opened wide the path towards Pearl Harbor, came in July 1941, when the Japanese pressured Vichy France into allowing them to occupy southern Indochina. This move directly threatened British possessions in Malaya and Singapore, costing the Japanese dearly, since it resulted in a total embargo of all raw materials, including oil, from the United States to Japan. America, Japan's biggest supplier of oil, now demanded they withdraw from China and Indochina. Shortly after, the British and Dutch also implemented the sanctions, leaving Japan without access to oil, and with only limited stocks remaining. And now, with Japan, a country completely dependent on natural resources from outside sources, cut off from the oil supplies, and lacking vital raw materials much needed for its economy and, at the same time, unwilling to accede to American demands for withdrawal from China, the path to war was wide open. The oil embargo was a turning point in relations between the two countries, and on September 6, 1941, just 6 weeks later, Emperor Hirohito authorized his army's plans for war with the United States, Britain, and Netherlands, leaving little room for peaceful negotiation. Diplomatic negotiations to avoid war dragged on for months, with both sides held firm to their positions, eliminating any chance of reaching a compromise. While it may appear the war in the Pacific was caused by failed negotiations, the reality was that when negotiations reached a dead end, in late November, the final preparations for attacks on the Philippines, Malaya, and Pearl Harbor were already set in motion. In the meantime, while the diplomatic efforts were still ongoing, in utmost secrecy, both sides began preparations for war, and here, Japan held an advantage. The country was at war for over a decade, fully mobilized in its conflict with China, while America, on the other hand, preoccupied with its neutrality and isolationism, was entirely unprepared for war. Under the careful oversight of a new Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo, who replaced Fumimaro Konoe in mid-October, the Japanese Navy and Army began preparing plans, carefully choosing targets for the upcoming offensive, aiming to secure the supply of raw materials so vital for their war effort. Aware that the events in Europe created a window of opportunity they were determined to exploit. However, the projected conflict with the United States allowed only a narrow window of little more than a year to achieve a victory that might force America to the negotiating table, fully aware that a long war against the Allies was unwinnable. Therefore, the speed and the element of surprise were crucial components of their upcoming military operation. The primary objective of the Japanese war plans was a conquest of Southeast Asia, the region rich in raw materials and, most importantly, the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch East Indies was then the fifth largest oil producer in the world, with an annual production of approximately 8 million tons, and was still under the control of the Dutch government in exile in London, following the German occupation of the Netherlands. This quantity of oil produced there exceeded the annual needs of Japan, and to them, it was also the nearest oil-producing location. However, to get there and secure their gains, the Japanese had to drive the British out of Malaya, which was the world's largest source of rubber and tin, and also from Burma. The Japanese High Command assumed that given the problems facing Britain and the Netherlands in the war against Germany, these two countries could not offer firm resistance, nor significantly reinforce their Far East garrisons. But before any offensive in Southeast Asia or the Pacific could begin, the Imperial Japanese Navy had to neutralize the United States Pacific Fleet, anchored in Pearl Harbor. For the Japanese planners, Burma was merely a secondary target of the campaign, and not only was Burma not regarded as a primary target, but it might also have been left uninvaded, had there not been a war in China. Since the occupation of French Indochina, the only remaining land route, used to deliver American Lend-Lease aid to China, ran from Rangoon through Mandalay and Lashio to Kunming. This, so-called Burma Road, became a primary artery for supplying China, and therefore, for the Japanese, closing this road soon became a strategic imperative. Earlier, on July 18, 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill closed the Burma Road to traffic, under pressure from the Japanese, but only 3 months later, due to American pressure, the road was opened again. In addition to cutting off this significant land line, Burma was also a source of raw materials, with particularly valuable oil wells at Yenengyang, and a wolfram mine at Morchi in the Karen Hills, that produced 1/3 of the world's wolfram. Corresponding with war plans, was the implementation of the Japanese political program, adopted back in 1940, known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which called for the independence of Asians from Western colonial rule, led by the Japanese under the political slogan, Asia for Asians, but in reality, was nothing more than the ambition of Japan, to replace Europeans as the ruler of their colonies in Southeast Asia. In these plans, Burma was to be a Western bastion of co-prosperity sphere, and also a springboard to potential Japanese advance, further to India. For the offensive in Southeast Asia, the Japanese gathered 11 divisions, grouped in the Southern Expeditionary Force, further divided into 4 armies. The 14th Army was to attack the Philippines from Taiwan, with its 2 divisions and 1 independent brigade. The other 3 armies, stationed in French Indochina, had to advance towards the west and south. The 16th Army, formed out of 2 divisions, was to assault vital islands of the Dutch East Indies. The strongest of 3 armies, the 25th, was to carry out the landings on Malaya and Thailand with its 4 divisions, and dash towards Singapore. The attack on Thailand and Burma was the task of the 33rd and the 55th Divisions of the 15th Army. The complex Japanese plan was highly flexible, allowing divisions, or sometimes even the elements of some divisions, to shift from army to army if needed. On the other side, in 1941, Britain was in a difficult position, after carrying the bulk of the war against Germany, for over 2 years, having been committed to fighting on 2 fronts. On the Atlantic, the Royal Navy was stretched to the limit, in trying to protect the vital supply routes against German U-boats, and yet, despite its efforts, barely sufficient supplies reached Britain. The Wehrmacht was just across the Channel, and even though the imminent threat of invasion had gone, when in June, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the Royal Air Force was still heavily engaged in a fight against the Luftwaffe, over France and the English Channel, which required all of their modern Spitfires and Hurricane fighters to be deployed in defense of home islands. On the other front in North Africa, Britain, with its Commonwealth allies, fought desperate battles against German and Italian forces, which absorbed most of the armor reserves and available land forces, leaving almost no reinforcements available to defend its Far East colonies. As a result, the British High Command centered the defense of the Far East on Malaya and the formidable fortress of Singapore. Here the British deployed bulk of their forces, consisting of an independent Indian brigade, 2 Indian, and 1 Australian division. In this center of gravity for the British defense in the Far East, they had built a number of air bases, where they stationed 158 planes, mainly outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, and Bristol Blenheim bombers, and a naval base, strategically positioned to dominate Southeast Asia, with a few warships they could spare, convinced that even with these limited forces, Singapore could be defended. Compared with Malaya, the British, just like the Japanese, regarded Burma as less important, and therefore in December 1941, only 2 British infantry battalions, 2 Indian infantry brigades, and 8 battalions of Burma Rifles, with various other units of the Frontier Guard, defended Burma's eastern frontier, some 2,000 kilometers long. At the outbreak of war, the largest single unit deployed in defense was the 1st Burma Division, commanded by Major General James Bruce Scott, which consisted of an Indian Mountain Regiment, the 13th Indian Infantry Brigade and the 1st Burma Brigade, and 1st and 5th Burma Rifles. Furthermore, half of the forces available for the defense were several separated Burma Rifle units and the Burma Frontier Force, which had the equivalent of approximately 6 battalions, divided into several detachments. The Burma Army had a very short existence, as until April 1937, Burma was administratively a province of India, when it was given a separate constitution, and administrated directly from London. As a result, the Burma Rifle units were composed not of Burmese but of Indians, enlisted from the same classes as the Indian Army. Frontier Guard units, on the other hand, were formed from a mixture of the local population, and were under the civilian administration, with doubtful fighting qualities, led by junior and inexperienced officers. Eventually, these units would become weaker, as a large number of the Burmese deserted, as soon as the fighting began. On January 5, the elements of the 17th Indian Division, under Major General Sir John Smith, arrived to reinforce the defense of Burma. This division was supposed to garrison Iraq, and therefore, 1/2 of the division troops were trained for desert warfare. After having previously sent 2 brigades to Malaya, only 7,000 men of the divisional headquarters, and the 46th Brigade remained. The artillery in Burma comprised only 4 mountain batteries, and 1 battery with 4 18-pounder guns, with a limited number of anti-aircraft guns. As with the ground, the air forces based in Burma, at the outbreak of war, were also modest, consisting of 1 fighter squadron equipped with Brewster Buffaloes, and 1 bomber squadron of Blenheims. By the time of the Japanese invasion, the bomber squadron was in Malaya for training, and was taken by Far East Command for Malayan operations. None ever returned to Burma. To reinforce the limited air force, the Chinese offered the assistance of the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, an air force composed of American pilots, who volunteered to defend China, equipped with P-40 fighters, and led by Colonel Claire Lee Chennault. According to the Chinese-British agreement, 1 squadron of the Flying Tigers always did remain for the defense of Rangoon. In addition to fighter planes, the Chinese also promised to send in Burma their 5th and 6th armies, but under the condition that they should not in any way be mixed up with British troops. These armies, led by American General Joseph W. Stilwell, were equivalent to a British division and had been moved into Burma from the Chinese province of Yunnan, between February and April, to help stem the surging Japanese tide. General Stilwell had been U.S. military attaché in China until 1939, and in January 1942, became Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek, and commander of the Chinese forces in North Burma. The complex command structure also played its part in the weaknesses of Burma's defense. In November 1940, the British Chiefs of Staff formed the Far East Command, and right after its foundation, Burma garrison had been assigned under its headquarters in Singapore, much to the frustration of General Sir Archibald Wavell, then Commander-in-Chief of India. Wavell considered that any failure in Burma would endanger India, so it was essential for Burma to be an integral part of India Command. On the other hand, Commander-in-Chief Far East, Air Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, was preoccupied with organizing the defense of Malaya, completely neglecting Burma, in believing that if Singapore remained in British possession, there was little danger elsewhere. In the meantime, Wavell made several attempts to transfer responsibility for the defense of Burma to India Command, and 5 days after the entry of Japan into the war, on December 12, his efforts paid off, when units soon to be known as Burma Corps came under the responsibility of the Commander-in-Chief in India. A few days later, on December 27, Wavell dispatched his deputy, General Thomas J. Hutton, to take over command in Burma. Immediately upon arrival, Hutton realized that Burma was absolutely unprepared for war. He made every effort to strengthen the defense and bring more reinforcements, but unfortunately, it was too late. The other factors also contributed to the neglect of Burma's defenses during the early part of the war. From the very beginning, the British underestimated the strength, ability, and determination of the Imperial Japanese Army, considering it to be inferior to their own. Furthermore, the British believed that, even if the Japanese made the invasion and achieved some progress, the terrain in Burma would slow down their advance long enough for them to bring the reinforcements. Large parts of this vast country were covered with dense jungles, and almost impenetrable mountains rising up to 3,500 meters in height, dominating the north and west. The great rivers, run roughly from north to south, of which the biggest is Irrawaddy, also provided the main highways and lines of communication, as the primitive railway and the few poor roads, merely following the river valleys. Finally, the false sense of security of Burma's defenses during the early part of the war could be understood, as it was considered protected by sharing most of its eastern border with, by then, a neutral state, Thailand. All that changed on the morning of December 8, only hours after the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, when the invasion of Malaya and Thailand began. The Japanese troops penetrated Thailand in several places, encountering only moderate resistance. The small-scale fighting lasted until December 21, 1941, when the Thai government signed a treaty of friendship with Japan, becoming its ally, and allowing the Japanese troops free passage through the country. With Thailand switching sides, the doors to Burma were now wide open.